Camping. This is not a really long story, but I had a really freaky experience once when I was camping. This was when I was at summer camp actually. Although we spent most of the time in the camp and sleeping in cabins, there was a few days where some of the older campers, which I was, would go on a hiking trip. And then we had to put up tents and sleep in them, which really wasn't one of my favorite things to do. Sleeping in a canvas tent in a sleeping bag on the ground was never something I understood why people enjoyed. However, I did really like everything else about summer camp. I was 14 years old when this happened. It was on the second night of the hiking trip. It's when we got as far from the camp as we did before circling back on our way back. There wasn't a lot that we knew about the area except that it was owned by the camp. But beyond that area, there were all sorts of weird summer camp stories about who lived that far out in the woods. So, on that night I was laying in my tent. I was having a really hard time falling asleep. As I was laying in my bag, I heard a really weird sound outside. It was like some sort of rattling noise. I knew it wasn't a snake though, because we didn't have them in that area of the country. It was just a really weird noise. My tent had a little screen on the side of it. And when I looked out of it in the direction I had heard the noise come from, I saw the weirdest thing. It looked like there was someone or something standing off in the trees looking in the direction of the camp. He was making some weird movements, almost like he was doing some sort of dance or something. I guess the rattling sound happened because he was shaking something. One of the counselors must have been awake and noticed it too. He got out of his tent and shone his flashlight over at the figure. I only got a quick look at him before he turned and ran off into the woods. Only thing I really noticed was that he was wearing a black mask over his face. It was at that point that I came out of my tent. I went over to the counselor, Steve, and asked him if he knew who or what that was. Steve seemed a little shaken up. I told him that I had seen the guy too and asked if he had any idea who it was. For a moment, I thought perhaps it might have been a prank or something like that. But Steve seemed so upset by seeing the guy that I didn't think this for very long. We talked about it a lot. Steve was convinced it was some sort of hoodoo man or witch doctor. I guess that is what bothered him, and at the time the idea bothered me too. I went to camp for years after that, and never heard the rattle or saw the weird man again, and that's a good thing. Snowy walk. For a period of time, I was living by myself in a house that my parents owned. There had been more homes when they had first bought the place, but due to constant flooding, a lot of the houses had been purchased by FEMA and then torn down. After that, lots of trees of shrubs grew in their place. The area then had very few houses anymore, however they had a lot of forested area. My parents moved out of state, and I stayed in the house for my last year of college simply because I could stay there for free. Unfortunately for me, however, during that fall, my car stopped working. My university was in the city, and it generally took me about an hour to drive there. So I had to find a new way to get to and from school. There was a train station, but it was at least an hour and a half walk from the house. I didn't have a bicycle or anything like that. So I had to walk there in the morning and from there in the evening in order to attend school. On Tuesday I had a late class and it was around 11 p.m. by the time that I got off of the train and began walking home. And not only that, but it had begun lightly snowing while I was riding on the train. So there was a fresh covering of snow on the ground while I was walking the hour and a half to get home. It was so dark by the time I got to the neighborhood. As I mentioned, it was an old neighborhood and there weren't any lights other than the porch lights that some houses had on. But at least I knew once I got in that area it would only be a few more minutes until I was in the warmth of my house. The snow on the ground is important to know about because if you know that scrunching sound that it makes when you walk on it, I was of course hearing that as I walking. But at one point, when I was walking in the darkest part of the neighborhood, I heard what sounded like some scrunching behind me. I was about to turn around and see if someone was behind me, but before I could, I heard a voice say, "Don't you dare turn around, or I'll kill you." I didn't know what to do, but I decided to not turn around. I mean, I don't know if I believed that the guy was going to kill me or not, but I was shocked and scared enough not to test the theory. Keep walking, the voice instructed me. And when I did, I heard the snow scrunching noises from both of us. We were on the street that my house was on, and there were no other houses on that street. And it was very, very dark. And I was very, very terrified. I didn't know the voice. I didn't know why he was walking behind me. And I didn't know if he was serious about hurting me or even if he had the ability to do so. It was a short walk through the dark of that street, but it was also the longest short walk of my life. However, something happened that I can't explain to this day. I could have sworn that I stopped hearing the other scrunching on the snow. I was right in front of my house, so there was a little bit of light. I turned around and was shocked when there was no one walking behind me at all. Now, there wasn't a lot of light outside. And it was very, very dark looking down the street. Someone could have been standing in the street further down. Or they could have slipped off into the woods. I really had no idea. But the one thing that I did know is that whoever had been following me stopped at some point, regardless of how they did. I didn't waste any time after that. I turned and sprinted up the driveway, got into the house and locked myself in. My parents had left a gun in the closet of the bedroom that had previously been theirs. I went and got it. Sometimes when I tell this story to people, they ask me why I didn't call the police. But what would I have told them? I heard a voice threaten me? I didn't know who it was, where they went off to or anything. And I never had an experience like that again. I have to tell you, however, that for a while, walking home from school that late at night was completely terrifying. I kept wondering if something weird like that was going to happen again. I eventually got over it, but thinking about it now still freaks me out a bit. The offer. When I went to elementary school, we had to walk to school. It was about a half-hour walk across the neighborhood, which was fenced in. Then it was across the road, which had a crossing guard, and then down the street to the school. Normally, since all the kids in the neighborhood went to school this way, there were tons of kids of all ages walking to and from school at the same time. I was in the 3rd grade at the time. Now, I don't really remember why, but for some reason I had to stay after school. I do remember that it was a dreary day though. But I was after school for quite a while. So when I began walking home, there weren't any other kids out. There weren't even kids out playing because of how dreary the weather was. I got through the crosswalk just fine. The guard wasn't there anymore, but it did have walking lights, so I used them. And I crossed the street, and then was back in my neighborhood. As I was walking on the sidewalk down one of the streets, a car pulled up right next to me. There was a man in the driver's seat who rolled his window down and began talking to me. So I stopped to see what he needed. "Pretty nasty looking day out here, huh, kid?" he asked me. "I hope I don't get rained on," I told him. "Well, just jump in the car here and I will give you a ride home," he offered. "That way you won't get rained on at all." This happened back in the 1970s, and there wasn't as much attention given to not going off with strangers back then. Still, I knew that I shouldn't get in the car. But I was stuck in a hard place because I was way overly polite as a kid. I didn't know how to turn down the offer, and because of that, I actually considered accepting it. Still, as I began to move to the car, something happened. A lady came running out of her home and toward me. When the guy driving the car noticed her, he began rolling up his window and quickly drove away. I was very confused, but the lady was very nice. She didn't know me, but she offered to walk me home. She didn't explain why to me, but being a young kid, the whole thing was so bizarre that I just thought it was a good idea. Apparently, as I found out later, there had been some child abductions in the neighborhood. There was a watch going on, and the lady was part of the watch. She noticed what was going on and feared that an attempted abduction was going on. I have no idea if that guy was actually trying to abduct me or not. But it's scary thinking what might have happened if I had gotten in that car. I am very grateful that the lady had been watching from her house that day. The park. I really didn't share my dating life with my parents when I was a teenager. I just thought they would not be accepting, or they would just keep trying to pry into my life. But honestly, if I offered to share it with them, I doubt they would have been interested. My parents were very absent a lot of the time. They paid a lot more attention to my little sister than they ever paid to me. But also, I was okay with that. I liked that I was mostly to myself. So I would go out and meet people and not really bring them home. I have had more dates just walking around than I could let anyone know. When I was 17, I met up with this guy in the city. Personally, I lived in the suburbs. But he sounded like a pretty cool guy, so we decided to meet up in the city. We had a nice little dinner at a diner. I don't always like to put the cart before the horse, but I figured that everything went well and we probably had a nice shot of having another date. After the dinner, I offered to walk him back to his place. But he suggested that we go for a walk in the park instead. It was a cool fall night and I liked that kind of weather. It seemed romantic to me. So we went for a slow, leisurely walk through the park. After a while, we walked off the trail. We came to the point where there was a nice big tree surrounding by fallen leaves. We sat down under the tree and we continued to talk. All in all, it was one of the most pleasant nights that I can remember. When we got up to walk, we made it back to the path. We must have lost track of time because it was much later than either of us had planned to stay out. So finally we decided I would walk him back to his place before I went home myself. There weren't many people out this late. But there was one guy that we walked by who was walking off to the side and talking on his cell phone. We didn't think anything about it. But then, not but a few moments after we had passed him on the path, he turned around and then began walking in the same direction as we did. While we were walking, the guy started talking louder. It was almost as if he wanted us to hear him talking. We tried to ignore him, but he kept talking loud enough and was talking about some really disturbing things that we had to keep listening. The guy was talking as if he had a dead body that he had to bury. He was going on and on about it, talking about different ways of doing the thing. He had mentioned dismembering and using lime or something like that. We didn't really want to take it seriously, assuming that the guy was just being a douchebag or something. He may have been trying to scare us or something like that. I do hate to admit that it was getting to us. But mostly because it seemed like he was deliberately following us and talking too loud to bug us. Then we heard him say, "Oh no, I haven't killed anyone. I was just wondering in a hypothetical scenario how one would dispose of a body or two if they had." It was still weird that he was doing this, but we felt a little bit better. That was until he said, "Well, I am following these two guys in the park right now." Needless to say, that scared us and we ran until we got out of the park. And once we were out, we turned and looked. We didn't see anyone and were shaken but very thankful. I mean, it probably was just a guy pranking us or something. But in the moment, it was very terrifying.